This is week 154 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Anna Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. The Moscow Times reported on Wednesday that the long-embattled city of Chasiv Yar had finally fallen to Russia, a report that was quickly contradicted by Ukrainian officials, OSINT analysts, and even some Russian military bloggers, who claim that fighting is still ongoing in the city. That's not to say that things are looking good. A spokesperson for the National Guard confirmed that Russia has intensified its attacks and deployed well-trained units to Chasiv Yar, tipping the battle in Russia's favor at present. Chasiv Yar, along with Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and other cities along the front line in Donetsk Oblast, have seen brutal fighting for months that yields steady incremental gains by Russia. Chasiv Yar is particularly important among those towns from a strategic point of view, as it's the most elevated point in the area and will give Russia the literal high ground if it falls. If Russia gets this advantage, it will severely endanger Ukraine's last footholds in Donetsk Oblast. Chasiv Yar lies just 12 miles from Kramatorsk, the adopted administrative center and transport hub of the region, since Russia occupied the actual regional capital, Donetsk, in 2014. Russia makes no secret its goal to occupy the entirety of Donetsk Oblast, right up to its western borders, and more than a decade into its invasion, we have little reason to believe that they'd be satisfied with stopping there. It should be noted, however, that for the first week in a long time, Russia's assault intensity is reported to have declined. Russian offensives peaked in frequency in mid-December, after ramping up in November. If in November there were over 5,000 assaults, December saw more than 6,000, and then January dwindled back down to the 4,000s. The slowdown is attributable to changes in Russian strategy, with more concentrated assaults occurring in the Pokrovsk direction amid fewer overall assaults. Continuing to give bold orders right out of the gate, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a blanket freeze on all foreign aid for a 90-day period, while his new administration determines whether existing aid promises are in line with their goals. The White House said that it will ultimately fall to the discretion of Secretary of State Marco Rubio to determine where aid will be reinstated. Ukraine is the top recipient of U.S. development assistance, receiving over $17 billion in economic aid in the second year of Russia's full-scale invasion. In the wake of the order, U.S. diplomats sought an urgent exemption for Ukraine from the freeze, citing national security concerns. Symbolic though it was, and certainly a nightmare for many international organizations, the freeze doesn't mean that Ukraine is suddenly left defenseless. Experts told the Kyiv Independent that the freeze doesn't apply to funding programs through which the U.S. provides Ukraine with military aid, but rather to financial and humanitarian organizations that receive government funding for their work. The organizations hit hardest are nonprofits that provide a huge range of humanitarian services, often working with some of the most vulnerable segments of society. One sector struggling in the wake of the freeze is independent media. In Ukraine, where independent journalism is still developing in competition with non-independent, oligarch-funded media, foreign grants are often a lifeline. A grant from the U.S. government can be the thing that keeps a local newsroom running, and a frozen grant can deprive a community of its only reliable source of news. The Kyiv Independent is fortunate in this regard. We're reader-funded rather than grant-funded, so this freeze doesn't affect us. Our peers are not so lucky, with many on the verge of halting operations. The Kyiv Independent has launched a fundraiser to help 3 local Ukrainian newsrooms in frontline cities who have been relying on American grants to report on Russia's war. Sukar, a newsroom in Sumy who write human stories and receive 60% of their funding from American aid. Gwara Media in Kharkiv, whose investigative work is 50% U.S. funded, and Mikvisti in Mykolaiv, who fully rely on U.S. aid to provide news to their local community. All 3 of these newsrooms are necessary players in documenting Russia's war, and the money raised in this fundraiser will allow them to pay their journalists, keep the lights on, and continue their reporting. There will be a link to the GoFundMe in the description below. This week saw one of the biggest scandals in wartime Ukraine, which has undermined a crucial reform in weapons procurement. Ukraine set to reform its defense procurement over a year ago, following a number of corruption scandals in 2023. The Defense Ministry created 2 state bodies to do the job: the Defense Procurement Agency, tasked with buying weapons, and the State Rear Operator, tasked with buying non-lethal goods for the Army, such as clothing and food. The crucial step of the reform was to create 2 independent supervisory boards for both agencies that would oversee their work and hire and dismiss their directors based on their performance. This setup was supposed to ensure the independence of both agencies and protect them from political pressure. But just as supervisory boards were formed and started making their first decisions, Defense Minister Rustem Umerov announced a decision that overrides one of the boards and ultimately undermines the entire reform. Just days after the supervisory board of the Defense Procurement Agency prolonged the contract with its head, Marina Bezrukova, Umerov announced that he had decided to dismiss her. He also decided to withdraw state representatives from the board, who voted for extending Bezrukova's contract. There's been a long-standing conflict between Umerov and Bezrukova. Bezrukova stood up to the pressure from the ministry to deal with manufacturers that didn't have capabilities to deliver on contracts. Umerov said that Bezrukova failed to meet delivery plans. Whether Bezrukova indeed failed in her position was up to her agency's supervisory board to decide. That's why they initiated an audit to assess the agency's results. For the time being, Umerov temporarily replaced Bezrukova with Arsen Zhumadilov, the director of the other procurement agency, the State Rear Operator. Sources told the Kyiv Independent that Umerov and Zhumadilov are close, but Umerov claims that he wants Zhumadilov in the role solely because his agency delivered better results. Umerov's unlawful decision sparked an outrage in Ukraine, with anti-corruption activists calling for his dismissal, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau launching an investigation into Umerov's potential abuse of power. It's not clear how much time the investigation and legal disputes over the decision will take, and when the situation will stabilize. What is clear is that a state agency with a $7 billion annual budget and a crucial job during war found itself in turmoil that could have been avoided. Instead, the scandal is hampering a key wartime reform and tarnishing Ukraine's reputation among allies. There's been a hotly debated story in the last month that saw a dramatic new update this week. The story is about Oscar Jenkins, a 32-year-old teacher from Melbourne, Australia, who joined the armed forces of Ukraine last year. He had no prior military experience and joined Ukraine's Foreign Legion as a volunteer. In case you're not familiar, people from countries around the world can voluntarily join Ukraine's military and fight against Russia, although individual countries have their own laws about whether their citizens are allowed to fight for other countries. Australian foreign fighters have been found among the ranks of Ukraine's armed forces throughout the full-scale invasion, with former soldiers and civilians like Jenkins taking up arms to defend against Russian aggression. Jenkins was reported missing in mid-December while on a combat mission in Ukraine's eastern Luhansk Oblast. A video emerged soon after on Russian Telegram channels, in which the missing Jenkins appeared, answering interrogative questions given off-camera by Russian soldiers. The man in the video was covered in mud, he had his hands tied, and he was being repeatedly hit in the face by someone who stayed off camera. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation independently verified Jenkins' identity, proving that he had indeed been taken as a prisoner of war. Not long after the video emerged, unverified reports began circulating in Ukrainian, Australian, and other foreign media that Jenkins had been killed in captivity. Although at least 6 Australian volunteer fighters have been killed in combat by Russia while fighting for Ukraine, Jenkins was the first to be taken prisoner, and Canberra made clear that if proved, his death would provoke diplomatic consequences. The Geneva Convention stipulates ethical and humane treatment of all prisoners of war and considers the death of prisoners at the hands of enemy captors as a war crime. Worrying, however, is Russia's history of blatantly flaunting the Geneva Convention. Russians have executed Ukrainian POWs on many isolated occasions throughout the war, and those who survive Russian captivity bear physical and mental scars of torture that is the systemic norm, not the exception, within the Russian military. It was a relief, then, when Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong announced on Wednesday that Jenkins is still alive and still in captivity, and that Canberra is advocating for his release. There's still no public information about Jenkins' whereabouts or anything else related to his case, only that he's alive. Ukraine's ambassador to Australia claimed that Russia had refused to provide proof of life for Jenkins for over a month after his capture, with the goal of provoking anguish among his loved ones and the public. This story is ongoing. There are still many questions, and there will continue to be until Jenkins is released and can provide his own account of his capture. Foreign fighters have been released from Russian captivity before, and it's hopeful that Jenkins will follow soon. That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. Your support is what allows us to bring you independent, unbiased news about Russia's brutal invasion, which we are committed to doing no matter how much uncertainty the world faces. If you'd like to become a member of the Kyiv Independent community, please visit the link in the description below. I'll see you next week.